The Human Rights Commission and the CRL Rights Commission say it's now up to police and the NPA to make a conclusive finding on whether the July 2021 unrest was connected to the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma. They released a joint report today that looked at some of the issues that basically culminated in the days of unrest that we witnessed in the main in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng. By the end of those riotous days, business had lost billions of rands, but perhaps most significantly, more than 300 people had been killed. Let's talk now to Edward Mafadza, who is the CEO at the CRL Rights Commission. A very good evening to you, sir. Good to have your time on Newzroom Afrika. So much of what this report has said, has found, especially around the inefficiencies at an intelligence and policing level, had been said in an earlier report that ultimately led to changes to cabinet, right? How does this report help us better understand what happened in 2021?
Good evening, Tembekile, and to the viewers. Perhaps let me foreground my answer to your question by indicating that the two institutions were actually releasing two different reports, and each institution was actually independent, aligned to its own mandate. So some of the content may be much more relevant to the other institution, depending on how the questions were framed. Nevertheless, one should be able to answer some of the questions because one was part of the process throughout. Now, one thing that we must acknowledge is that the reports of both institutions managed to give light and information to the nation in terms of what had actually transpired. Although some of the desires that comes from some of the allegations from our own investigations, you will find that there was no tangible information that came forward for us to be able to sustain some of the arguments. However, looking at the events and the engagements, one is able to tell that indeed in one area or the other, those that were from the security cluster indeed were found wanting, not because perhaps they were supposed to be camping in those areas before the event from our own analysis, but because when such things happen, you need to always restore order in such areas. And that in itself would have exposed those that are responsible for such clusters.
And a crucial takeaway, though, from the investigations is that as we search for context to make sense of what happened in 2021, the sources of what we saw, or the source thereof, does not come down to one single thing, i.e., as even the Human Rights Commission was saying today, it wasn't all linked to the incarceration of President Jacob Zuma. In fact, they said there was no conclusive evidence of a link in that regard.
Yeah, from our own investigations as the CRL Rights Commission, we actually unearthed a very interesting point that the tensions between the Africans and the Indians in KwaZulu-Natal is much more historical. It's something that actually happened, and I would say the 2021 is likely to have been the third one. And the ironical part of it is that it happens actually after almost the same period of years. Then a similar incident happens. So you'll find that there's always has been the tension between the Africans and the tension historically. And that's what came out very clearly from our investigations as we were engaging with the communities. Well, of course, we agree with the Human Rights Commission that, it is not solely, tilting towards the incarceration of the former president, because you will find that the Human Rights Commission, in terms of their presentation and their information, they even gave a platform for people to come forward with the evidence to substantiate such allegations. But unfortunately, they couldn't gather that kind of information to substantiate the point.
Right.
So we would say then it was something that has been there, between the two communities.
And Mr. Mafadza, you mentioned the issue of racism. You spoke to that in the report, especially about the situation in Phoenix, where what you uncovered, in fact, was confirmation of pre-existing racial tension, racism, between the predominantly Indian community and the surrounding black townships, right? But also socio-economic factors, which basically were manipulated in a way, it's fair to say, I think, in order to take advantage or even draw those people who may have been feeling disenfranchised because they're poor, without jobs, neglected, drawing them into that moment of crisis. What should be the response to that as far as government is concerned? How do we better the communities?
I think it's a very interesting point because, one comes to a point where we think we should deliberately and intentionally try to address some of these situations so that, we can address the past imbalances when it comes to issues of control of properties, in control of economy and management, but also to create a space so that, the spatial planning that we have, especially in black areas around Phoenix, like Kwamashu and others, so that, the facilities that are in Phoenix, they are also found in other areas. Because our observation is that those black communities that are living closer to Phoenix, their lives are in Phoenix because everything that they want, they must be traveling to Phoenix. You mentioned the clinics, you talk of hospitals, you talk of schools, you talk of shops and shoppings and so on and so forth. So we must intentionally begin to address those issues and create space even for African communities so that there's no community that looks down upon the other. And of course, we must also globally, within the province of KwaZulu-Natal, to deal with this tension, intentionally try and create an equal opportunities for businesses to thrive so that the black and African communities as well, they become part of ownership of businesses. And because if we don't do that, this scenario or the status quo will not be able to be changed.
And the other strand that I picked up on it during the briefing this morning is that there is a distance, right, a dangerous distance between government and communities, where you've got, yes, the official structures, policing, intelligence, etc., that we can all look to and blame. But if government is not within the communities, not aware of what the daily conversations are within the context of a particular area or locality, there is a risk, is there not, of missing the signs of possibly a repeat of something similar to what happened in 2021.
You are very right. But what is interesting now is that government is aware. I mean, as both commissions, Human Rights Commission and the SAHRC Commission, part of the delays of releasing this report is that we were trying to consult, intensively with the relevant stakeholders, including the provincial legislature, so that, we brief them of the issues that we've unearthed, and we also share with them the recommendations so that at least they are aware in terms of what is happening and what needs to happen, so that in their planning and everything, they are able to integrate some of this thinking and put them into perspective so that they can deal with unforeseen circumstances that may be of similar nature in the future. So this time, I think they are aware, and government at a national level, the police themselves, you can see how serious they take this matter. They, all the way, the top guns of these SAPs were there today to listen to these recommendations all the way from Johannesburg. And it shows you that they are really wanting to understand this so that they can mitigate the same situations. If anything happens, they are aware that they should be able to deal with it in advance.
And just on the recommendations, Mr. Mafadza, which would you say that we absolutely as a country have to implement with speed to avoid a repeat of 2021 or a further simmering of tension and a loss of faith, most importantly, a loss of faith in structures such as the police and the broader government as far as its ability to make this a country within which everyone enjoys a good quality of life, feels safe, feels heard, feels seen and respected?
You have just summarized it. I think people are not looking for many things. They just want to have the facilities. They want to have access to, clinics in their own area space. They don't want to be undermined. They want their languages to be elevated. They want to have access to services using their own languages without any prejudice. And in that case, they want their children to be schooling and going to schools freely and when not traveling, long distances, and so that, they are seen to be valued by everyone. And I think we are not saying that government is not doing anything, but we are saying watch the Phoenix scenario and try to change it around and improve the lives of the people who are living closer to Phoenix.
And just lastly, on the issue of Phoenix, were you able from this investigation to gauge how vulnerable the rest of KZN is to similar incidences of racial tension or straight outright racism, and it leading to violence in the way that it did, where black people were profiled and told that there's no way you live in Phoenix, in some instances purely because there were black people who were driving to a store in what is still, because of apartheid spatial planning, and a predominantly Indian community?
Well, if we look at the scenario of Phoenix, it would be better to try and deal with it so that, it becomes a model for the whole province and eventually becomes a model for the whole country. Because if we don't do that, the chances are the very same, scenario that we see in Phoenix is likely to be dominating the province as well. Because we must not forget that, KZN is dominated by the Africans and not by the Indians. But if you look at the ownership of these businesses, they are with the Indians. And if we don't address these issues and balance and create a balance, then the black community will forever feel negated.
Good to speak to you, Mr. Edward Mafadza, CEO of the CRL Rights Commission.